August 17th, 1973. A Detroit alley, just blocks from Hitsville, USA. A man is found slumped near a car wearing nothing but swimming trunks. A gun in his right hand, a bullet wound on the left side of his head, a shattered bottle of Courvoisier by his left side. He was 34 years old. His name was Paul Williams, founding member of the Temptations, the original lead voice, the man who choreographed every step, every spin, every move that made Motown magic. Berry Gordy once called him the heart of the Temptations, praising his emotional baritone voice, his soul, his rhythm, his style. So how does the man who built the greatest vocal group in history end up dead in an alley with 2 bullets fired and only 1 wound? Was it suicide or something far darker? The truth involves debt disease, a shelved record, and a case that never added up. Paul Williams came into the world on July 2, 1939, in the Ensley neighborhood of Birmingham, Alabama, a place where gospel music poured out of church windows on Sunday mornings and the steel mills hummed the rest of the week. His father, Rufus Williams, sang in a local gospel group called the Ensley Jubilee Singers. His mother, Sophia, raised the family in a neighborhood where music wasn't a luxury. It was survival. From birth, Paul was surrounded by harmony. Before he could read, he could sing, and it was singing that would lead him to the most important friendship of his life. In elementary school, Paul met a skinny kid named Eddie Kendricks. The story goes that their first encounter wasn't exactly friendly. According to accounts repeated across multiple biographies, Paul dumped a bucket of mop water on Eddie's head, which promptly led to a fist fight. But somewhere between the swinging fists and the bruised egos, the 2 boys discovered they shared something deeper than rivalry. They both loved to sing. Before long, they were standing side by side in their church choir, their voices blending as naturally as if they'd been born to do it. As teenagers, Paul and Eddie formed a secular singing group called the Cavaliers with friends Kel Osborne and Willie Waller. They renamed themselves the Primes, and in 1957, the group made the decision that would change everything. Paul, Eddie, and Kel left Birmingham and headed north, first to Cleveland, then to Detroit, chasing the dream that every young black singer in America was chasing in the late 50s. A record deal, a shot. In Detroit, the Primes found a manager and started performing around town. They even helped create a sister group called the Primettes, a collection of young women who would eventually become the Supremes. The connections were already forming. The Motown universe was pulling itself together, and Paul Williams was right at the center of it. But the Primes didn't last. In 1960, Kel Osborne moved to California, and the group fell apart. Eddie went back to Alabama. Paul stayed in Detroit alone, but unwilling to let the dream die. Then came the phone call that changed everything. Eddie, visiting Paul in Detroit, learned that a local singer named Otis Williams had 2 openings in his group, The Distance. Paul and Eddie auditioned. They got in. Alongside Otis Williams, Melvin Franklin, and Elbridge Al Bryant, they formed a new group called the Elgins. In March of 1961, they signed with Berry Gordy's young Motown label and changed their name one final time: the Temptations. Paul Williams was 21 years old. He was the group's lead singer. He was their best dancer, and he became their first choreographer, designing the sharp synchronized routines that would become the visual signature of Motown itself. Every glide, every turn, every perfectly timed hand gesture that audiences associated with the Temptations came from Paul's mind and Paul's body. But a record deal didn't mean instant success. For 3 long years, the Temptations released single after single that went nowhere. Paul sang lead on their debut, "Oh Mother of Mine," and on early tracks like "Slow Down Heart" and "I Want a Love I Can See." The songs were good, the harmonies were tight, but the hits didn't come. It was a brutal education in patience. 5 young men crammed into cars, playing small venues, watching other Motown acts break through while they stayed stuck. But Paul kept them together. He kept them rehearsed. He kept them moving. If Otis Williams was the business mind of the Temptations, Paul Williams was the creative engine, the one who made sure that when their moment finally came, they'd be ready. And in 1964, their moment came. "The Way You Do the Things You Do" cracked the Billboard Top 20. The floodgates opened. "My Girl," "Ain't Too Proud to Beg," "I Know I'm Losing You." The Temptations became the biggest male vocal group in America, and Paul Williams had helped build every piece of it. But here's the cruel thing about building something that powerful. The machine doesn't care who built it. And by 1965, the very group Paul Williams had shaped from nothing was already beginning to leave him behind. The hits kept coming and they came fast. By 1965, the Temptations were no longer just another Motown act. They were the crown jewels. 5 voices, 5 personalities, 5 sets of perfectly polished shoes moving in unison across every stage in America. They were on Ed Sullivan. They were on every radio in every barbershop in every black neighborhood from Detroit to Los Angeles. They were untouchable. But inside the group, a quiet shift was happening. And Paul Williams felt it before anyone else. When David Ruffin joined in 1964, replacing the increasingly volatile Al Bryant, everything changed. Ruffin had a voice that could strip paint off walls, a raw, desperate tenor that producers couldn't resist. Smokey Robinson started writing hits for Ruffin's voice. Eddie Kendricks, with his soaring falsetto, claimed the other half of the spotlight. Between the two of them, the lead vocal duties that had once belonged to Paul were slowly, methodically reassigned. Paul went from being the voice of the Temptations to standing in the back, singing harmony, watching 2 other men sing the songs that sold millions while he swayed and smiled and hit his marks. According to multiple accounts, Paul eventually went to Smokey Robinson and made his frustration known. His exact words, as recalled in several sources, were blunt. He told Smokey he could sing too. Robinson listened, and in 1965, Paul was given lead on a new track called Don't Look Back, co-written by Robinson and Ronald White, the same pair who had written My Girl. The song became Paul's signature. The Temptations performed it on The Ed Sullivan Show, and it became the closing number of their live set for years to come. It was a gift, but it was also a consolation prize, and Paul knew the difference. Meanwhile, his role as choreographer was slipping away too. Motown hired Charlie Atkins, a legendary dance coach, to work with all their acts. Atkins was brilliant. He was also, from Paul's perspective, a replacement. The routines Paul had built from nothing, the visual language he had invented for the Temptations and even for the Supremes, including their iconic "Stop in the Name of Love" hand gesture, were now being refined, managed by someone else. By somewhere. By the mid-60s, Paul Williams had lost his position as lead singer and his role as choreographer. He was still a Temptation. He was still on every record, every tour, every television appearance. But the thing that had made him essential was gone. And that void needed to be filled with something. It was filled with Courvoisier. According to Otis Williams' autobiography, Paul had never been a drinker. In the early days of the Temptations, he was the one who lectured the others about ruining their health with alcohol. He drank nothing stronger than milk. But sometime around 1965, that changed. Otis later recalled how difficult it was to watch the transformation, describing how Paul went from drinking milk to consuming 2 or 3/5 of Courvoisier a day. The drinking coincided with another complication. In 1965, Paul began an affair with Winnie Brown, a hairstylist who worked with the Supremes and was a relative of Supremes member Florence Ballard. By all accounts, Paul fell hard for Winnie, but he was also, according to those who knew him, deeply devoted to his wife Mary Agnes and their 5 children. He was a man caught between 2 lives, unable to choose either one. The guilt ate at him. The drinking got worse. And underneath all of it was something nobody outside the group fully understood. Paul Williams had sickle cell anemia. The disease had been with him his entire life, causing chronic pain, exhaustion, and physical deterioration that worsened with age and the demands of touring. According to the Sickle Cell Disease Association of America, his battle with the illness was hidden from the public. Paul didn't talk about it. He didn't seek sympathy. He just drank to kill the pain and kept getting on stage. In 1968, Paul shared lead vocals with new member Dennis Edwards on Cloud 9, which won the Temptations their first Grammy Award. It was a creative peak, a moment that proved Paul still had it, but by then the drinking had become impossible to ignore. In the spring of 1969, Paul and Winnie Brown opened a celebrity fashion boutique in downtown Detroit called Celebrity House West. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a life beyond the stage. Instead, it became a financial disaster. The business failed, and Paul found himself buried under more than $80,000 in unpaid taxes. In today's money, that would be well over $500,000. So by the end of the 60s, the man who had co-founded the Temptations, who had choreographed their rise, who had sung lead on their first records, was now a background singer in his own group battling a chronic illness. Nobody knew about drowning in alcohol, torn between two women, and staring down a mountain of debt. The Temptations were selling out arenas around the world. Paul Williams was falling apart inside every single one of them. By 1969, the deterioration was no longer something Paul could hide on stage. The sickle cell anemia was destroying him from the inside. The alcohol was destroying him from the outside. Combined, they left him gasping for air mid-performance, his body buckling under the weight of routines he had once designed with effortless precision. Otis Williams later wrote in his autobiography that he watched a general physical breakdown unfold. Paul was having trouble keeping up on stage, gasping for breath, yet still refusing to stop smoking cigarettes. The group began traveling with an oxygen tank which they kept in the wings for Paul between numbers. His bandmates did everything they could think of. They took turns raiding his hotel rooms and dressing rooms, pouring out bottles of Courvoisier, emptying hidden stashes. They tried personal interventions one after another. They begged him to see a doctor. Paul refused every time. But the show had to go on, and Motown didn't wait for broken men to heal. The solution the Temptations came up with was as ingenious as it was heartbreaking. Richard Street, the lead singer of another Motown group called the Monitors, was quietly hired to travel with the Temptations. His job was to stand backstage, hidden behind a curtain, and sing all of Paul's vocal parts live while Paul moved through the choreography on stage. The audience never knew. Paul's microphone was reportedly turned off for most of the performance. The only songs Paul was still allowed to actually sing were his signature numbers, Don't Look Back, and For Once in My Life, the ones the crowd specifically associated with his voice. Think about that for a moment. The man who had built the Temptations from the ground up, who had created their visual identity, who had been their original voice, was now silently mouthing words on stage while another man sang his parts from behind a curtain. It was by any measure a slow and public erasure. In April of 1971, Paul was finally persuaded to see a doctor. The news was devastating. Doctors found a spot on his liver and advised him to retire from performing immediately. There was no negotiation, no second opinion that could change the reality. Paul Williams left the Temptations. Richard Street stepped out from behind the curtain and became his permanent replacement. To their credit, the group didn't abandon him. Paul was kept on the payroll as an advisor and choreographer. He continued to receive his 1/5 share of the Temptations' royalties. The intention was to give him a foundation to rebuild his life. But what do you rebuild when everything that defined you has been taken away? Paul's marriage to Mary Agnes was falling apart. A divorce was pending. His health was shattered. The $80,000 tax debt from the failed boutique still hung over him. And now the stage, the one place where Paul Williams had always been able to transcend his pain, was gone. By early 1973, Paul attempted a comeback. He returned to Motown's Hitsville, USA studios to record solo material. His childhood friend Eddie Kendricks, who had also left the Temptations by then, co-wrote and produced Paul's first single, a song called Feel Like Givin' Up. The plan was to release it on Motown's Gordy imprint. But according to Paul's brother Joseph Williams, Motown told Paul before his death that none of the solo songs he had recorded would ever be released. Joseph later recalled the devastation this caused, saying that Motown scrapped everything, and that what they were really doing was killing Paul. Joseph claimed they wouldn't release him to record elsewhere, and that they never even paid him for the sessions. Other accounts suggest Motown shelved the single only after Paul's death because the title, Feel Like Givin' Up, was too painfully literal in the wake of what happened. The truth may lie somewhere between these two versions. What is certain is that the record never came out during Paul's lifetime. By the summer of 1973, Paul Williams had lost his group, his voice, his marriage, his money, his health, and now his shot at a solo career. He was 34 years old, living in Detroit with nothing left but questions about what might have been. And on August 17, 1973, those questions followed him into an alley he would never leave. In the months before his death, Paul Williams reportedly told two of the people closest to him that he wanted to die. According to Otis Williams, Paul had expressed suicidal thoughts to both him and Melvin Franklin in the months leading up to August 1973. These weren't passing comments. They were confessions from a man who had run out of reasons to keep going. But not everyone saw it that way. According to Tony Turner's account in Deliver Us from Temptation, Eddie Kendricks had visited Paul just days before his death and found him in a relatively positive mood. Eddie, the man who had known Paul since they were children throwing punches over a bucket of mop water in Birmingham, didn't see a man preparing to die. He saw his friend. Tired, yes. Beaten down, certainly, but not finished. Which version was true? The man confessing to his bandmates that he wanted it all to end, or the man his oldest friend saw still holding on? Maybe both. Maybe that's the cruelest part. On the evening of August 17, 1973, while the Temptations were in New York attending the wedding of group member Damon Harris, Paul drove to the new house he had bought for his girlfriend, Winnie Brown. What happened inside that house depends on which account you believe. Tony Turner wrote that Paul arrived to find Winnie partying with friends and became upset. Other accounts simply describe an argument between the two. What every source agrees on is that Paul left that house angry, hurt, and alone. He got in his car. He drove into the warm Detroit night. He ended up in an alley at the corner of 14th Street and West Grand Boulevard, just a few blocks from the Hitsville USA building, where he had once stood in Studio A and sung with the greatest vocal group in the world. What happened next in that alley remains one of Motown's most enduring mysteries, because when the story picked up again, Paul Williams was no longer alive to tell it. Sometime in the late hours of August 17, 1973, a man was found in an alley near 14th Street and West Grand Boulevard in Detroit. He was near a car. He was wearing nothing but swimming trunks. There was a gun. There was blood. And there was no one else around. 2 days later, on August 19th, the Detroit Free Press ran a short article on page 67. The headline read, "Former Temptations singer found dead." The report was brief and clinical. It stated that Paul Williams, 34 years old, an original member of the Temptations, had been found slumped in the front seat of a car. He had died of a gunshot wound to the head. A gun was in his hand. He was wearing only swimming trunks. Police identified him through a fingerprint check. That was it. A few column inches for a man who had helped build one of the most successful musical acts in American history. Page 67. The official ruling was suicide. According to multiple sources, the news reached the Temptations in New York, where they were celebrating Damon Harris's wedding. Richard Street, the man who had once sung Paul's parts from behind a curtain, made the call. The celebration stopped. The weight of what had happened settled over the group like something physical. Back in Detroit, the machinery of death moved forward. Paul's wife, Mary Agnes, was notified. His children, his brothers, his friends. The grief spread outward from that alley in concentric circles, touching everyone who had ever heard him sing. Paul Williams's body was taken to the Cole Funeral Home, where over the following days more than 2,500 people came to view him. 2,500 people standing in line to say goodbye to a man the Detroit Free Press had given less space than a used car advertisement. The funeral was held on August 24, 1973 at the Tried Stone Baptist Church. The church was packed. Family, friends, Motown executives and artists, and as many fans as could squeeze through the doors. His wife Mary and their children were there. The men who had stood beside him on stages around the world were there too. Eddie Kendricks, David Ruffin, Dennis Edwards, Melvin Franklin, Otis Williams, Cornelius Grant, the guitarist so close to the group he was often called the Sixth Temptation. All six served as pallbearers. During the service, Dennis Edwards, the man who had replaced David Ruffin and shared lead vocals with Paul on Cloud 9, stood up and began to sing The Impossible Dream. It was one of Paul's signature live performances, a song he had made his own during the 1968 TCB television special with Diana Ross and the Supremes. Dennis made it through part of the song before the emotion overtook him. He couldn't continue. And then, according to an account in the Detroit Free Press from August 25th, Melvin, Otis, and Eddie stepped in and sang him through to the end. The Temptations singing together one last time for the man who had started it all. At the service, Motown executive Esther Edwards addressed the mourners. Her words, as reported by the Detroit Free Press, spoke to something larger than one man's death. She told the congregation that in Europe, in Africa, and Asia, all over the world, young men sing in groups in a fashion created by the Temptations. They dance with choreography that so closely matches the Temptations. She said that one might think Paul had personally tutored them. It was a tribute to Paul's legacy. It was also, whether intentionally or not, a reminder of everything that had been taken from him while he was still alive. After the service, the Temptations took one last ride with Paul. They accompanied his body to the Lincoln Memorial Park Cemetery in Clinton Township, Macomb County, Michigan. He was laid to rest there, No more stages, no more spotlights, no more curtains to hide behind. Paul Williams was buried without a will. He left behind his estranged wife, Mary Agnes, 5 children with her, and 3 more children from other relationships. He left behind an unpaid tax debt, a shelved solo record, and a career that had been quietly dismantled piece by piece over the course of a decade. He also left behind questions that his family would spend the next 50 years asking, questions that the Detroit police never seemed particularly interested in answering. Because while the official story said Paul Williams drove to that alley and ended his own life, there were details in the coroner's report that didn't fit. Details that pointed somewhere else entirely. Details that to this day have never been adequately explained. And it is those details that we need to talk about next. The coroner's report should have closed the case. Instead, it opened a wound that has never healed. 3 details from the official findings have haunted Paul Williams's family for over 50 years. 3 details that taken individually might be dismissed. Taken together, they tell a story that doesn't match the word suicide. First, the gun was found in Paul's right hand. Paul was right-handed, but the bullet wound was on the left side of his head. To shoot himself in that location with his dominant hand, Paul would have had to angle the weapon across his own face in a manner that multiple commentators have described as impractical and unnatural. It's not impossible, but it is unusual. Second, a bottle of alcohol, reportedly Courvoisier, was found near Paul's left side. It was positioned as if he had been holding it in his left hand and dropped it at the moment he was shot. If Paul had shot himself with his right hand, the bottle in his left hand would suggest he was standing and drinking at the moment he pulled the trigger. But according to the Detroit Free Press, he was found slumped in the front seat of a car. Other accounts, including the IMDb trivia page for the 1998 Temptations miniseries, claim his body was found near the car, positioned as if he had been standing. The inconsistencies in these descriptions have never been resolved. Third, and perhaps most troubling, the gun had been fired twice. Paul Williams had only 1 wound. 1 bullet killed him. But 2 shots were fired. Where did the second bullet go? Was it a missed first attempt, a warning shot, or evidence of a struggle? The Detroit police ruled the death a suicide, and by all available evidence never pursued an alternative theory. The case was closed. No further investigation was conducted. Paul Williams was dead, and as far as the authorities were concerned, he had done it to himself. His family never accepted that conclusion. The Williams family has maintained for decades that some form of foul play was involved in Paul's death. They have pointed to the forensic anomalies, the rushed ruling, and the lack of any meaningful follow-up investigation. But suspicion without proof is just grief with nowhere to go. No charges were ever filed, no suspects were ever named, the case was never reopened. And then the money problems began. Paul Williams died without a will. Besides, he left behind an estate that was on paper complicated and in practice nearly worthless at the time. He was estranged from his wife, Mary Agnes. A divorce had been pending. Determining his rightful heirs became a legal maze that would take years to untangle. Worse still, according to reports in the Detroit News, the Williams family accused Motown of failing to pay any royalties after Paul's death. For 14 years, from 1973 to 1987, Paul's children reportedly received nothing from the music their father had helped create. In 1987, the family reopened Paul's estate to pursue what they believed they were owed. They claimed Motown owed approximately $195,000 in unpaid royalties. Motown's response was cold and corporate. The label argued that the family could not pursue royalties that were more than 6 years old. A legal technicality that, if upheld, would erase more than a decade of money owed to a dead man's children. The family eventually settled in March of 1988 for $96,520. That amount covered only the years 1981 through mid-1987. Everything before that was gone. But the tragedy didn't stop with unpaid royalties. Paul's son, Kenneth Williams, grew up in the shadow of his father's death. As a boy, he had lived a charmed life traveling on the road with the Temptations, spending afternoons at Motown headquarters with Dennis Edwards, who taught him how to make paper airplanes. After Paul's death, that world collapsed. In 1989, the same year Paul was posthumously inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Kenneth strangled his 81-year-old great-aunt Mary Bryant with a telephone cord during a crack cocaine-fueled episode. He was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 15 to 30 years in prison. Before going in, Kenneth asked his sister Paula to save his share of the royalty checks inherited from their father. When he was released more than 20 years later, the money estimated at over $200,000 was gone. Paula had spent it. Kenneth filed a federal complaint against her. A father was found dead in an alley with a gun. A son sent to prison for murder. A family tearing itself apart over the money that was supposed to honor a legacy. And through all of it, a single haunting question that nobody in a position of authority ever seriously tried to answer. What actually happened in that alley? Paul Williams had been stripped of his voice, his stage, his marriage, his health, and his solo career. He owed $80,000 in taxes and had a pending divorce. He was, by any measure, a man with nothing left to lose. But was he a man with something someone else wanted silenced? That question has hung over Motown for half a century, and it remains to this day unanswered. In January of 1989, 16 years after he was found dead in a Detroit alley, Paul Williams was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a member of the Temptations. He wasn't there to accept it. Neither in any meaningful sense was the truth about how he died. The honors continued. The Vocal Group Hall of Fame in 1999. The Rhythm and Blues Music Hall of Fame in 2013. His name etched into the permanent record of American music alongside Otis Williams, Melvin Franklin, Eddie Kendricks, and David Ruffin, the Classic Five, the lineup that defined what a vocal group could be. But look at what happened to those five men. Eddie Kendricks died of lung cancer in 1992 at 52. David Ruffin died of a cocaine overdose in 1991 at 50. Melvin Franklin's health deteriorated for years before he died in 1995 at 52 after a series of seizures. Paul was gone at 34. Of the original five Temptations, only Otis Williams survived, and as of this writing, he is still performing, still carrying the name forward, the last man standing from a group that conquered the world and paid for it with almost everything. Paul's story found its way into popular culture, though often in simplified form. In 1998, NBC aired a 4-hour miniseries called The Temptations, based on Otis Williams's autobiography. Actor Christian Payton portrayed Paul. The film depicted his decline and death, but like the official record, settled on suicide as the explanation. The forensic questions were left largely unexamined. Diana Ross's 1984 music video for Missing You paid tribute to 3 former Motown artists who had died: Marvin Gaye, Florence Ballard, and Paul Williams. 3 names, 3 tragedies. 3 people chewed up by the same machine that made them famous. In 2018, the Broadway musical Ain't Too Proud, The Life and Times of the Temptations, opened to critical acclaim. Paul's story became a central thread of the production's emotional core. Audiences who had never heard his name watched his rise and fall unfold on stage every night, and many walked out of the theater asking the same question his family had been asking for decades. What really happened? But beyond the awards and the dramatizations, Paul Williams's actual legacy lives in something most people never think about. Every synchronized step you've ever seen a vocal group perform traces a line back to him. Every boy band that ever rehearsed choreography in a studio, every R&B group that ever moved in unison under stage lights, is working within a tradition that Paul Williams helped create. He choreographed the Supremes' Stop in the Name of Love routine. He designed the visual language of Motown performance. The fact that his name is rarely mentioned in that context is part of the tragedy. And then there is the sickle cell dimension. Paul Williams lived with a chronic, painful, and at the time poorly understood disease that ravaged his body throughout his career. He hid it from the public. There were no awareness campaigns, no celebrity endorsements for sickle cell research in his name. He suffered in silence, medicated himself with alcohol because the medical infrastructure of the era offered him little else, and died before the world even knew he was sick. Today, the Sickle Cell Disease Association of America recognizes Paul as one of their notable warriors. It's an honor that arrived about 40 years too late. The question that hangs over Paul Williams's legacy is the same question that hangs over so much of Motown's golden era. What did the machine owe the men and women who built it? Paul gave the Temptations his voice, his body, his creativity, and his health. In return, he was gradually pushed to the margins, replaced behind a curtain, buried in debt, and left to unravel while the group he founded continued to sell out arenas without him. Could he have been saved? Better medical treatment for sickle cell, addiction counseling, mental health support. A record label that saw its artists as human beings instead of products. Any one of these things might have changed the ending. None of them were available to Paul Williams in 1973. The system that made him was not designed to save him, and by the time anyone thought to ask whether it should have been Paul, was already on the ground. 14th and West Grand Boulevard, a few hundred feet from Hitsville, USA, the building where Berry Gordy built an empire. The building where Paul Williams once stood in Studio A and sang with a voice that could make strangers cry. He ended up right back where he started. Not on stage, not behind a microphone, but in an alley alone in swimming trunks with a gun that fired 2 shots and a bottle of brandy he may or may not have dropped. The man who choreographed joy for millions could not choreograph his own escape. He designed every step the Temptations ever took, but in the end he couldn't find a single step that led somewhere safe. Every door closed. Every voice that might have spoken for him went quiet. Motown shelved his record. The police closed his case. The world moved on. His last recorded song was called Feel Like Giving Up. Whether he did or whether someone in that alley decided for him is a question that has outlived everyone who might have answered it honestly. The coroner said, suicide. The family said, murder. The evidence said, something doesn't add up. And Detroit said nothing at all. He was 34 years old. He had 5 children with his wife and 3 more from other relationships. He had a chronic disease that nobody talked about. He had a debt he couldn't pay and a talent that nobody wanted anymore. He had given everything he had to a group, a label, and an industry that took it all and kept moving. The Temptations closed their live shows for years with Paul's song, Don't Look Back. Every night in city after city, they sang those words. And after August 17, 1973, that's exactly what happened. Nobody looked back. Not the police, not Motown, not the industry that had built itself on the backs of men like Paul Williams. 50 years later, the alley is still there. The questions are still there. And Paul is still gone. Rest in peace, Paul Williams.